presentation. And following that, we will have a short intermission, which is about 20 minutes. There'll be a poll. Please take time to answer the questions that'll pop up on your screen if you're in GoToWebinar, or that you will have access to on Facebook. It's very important for us to do a bit of a pulse check as we go, so that we make sure that you're able to hear Sibongile, and so that we can course correct if there's anything that needs to be adjusted. Also, there is a survey at the end of the session. Please take some time to complete that as well. That's very important for us, not only for the logistics of the webinar, but for us to have a better idea of how best to tailor the content of these presentations to everybody who's listening. All of this material, both the video recording as well as the presentation that Sibongile will be taking us through, will be made available at the end of the session. So there will be an email sent out to all the participants, and you can also drop us a note on the WhatsApp group if you need, on the WhatsApp line, sorry, if you need any of this information sent to you. So thank you very much. I'm going to hand over to Sibongile.
Okay. Thank you, Kay, for that introduction, and welcome to this webinar. Our colleague Lindy Wekosa was supposed to join us today, but for reasons beyond her control and our control, she's not able to be with us. So we are going to try and make do and make sure that you get the information that you are supposed to get today. Today, we are going to talk about the legislative framework, and this is really a follow-up conversation from where we started in week 3, when we were talking about the operational and institutional arrangements for implementing the National Strategic Plan. Today, we are going to start with a bit of a recap, and then go on to look at the core components using comparative examples from other countries on how they have tried to legislate. And then from there, we are going to come up with a set of recommendations for Department of Justice on some of the things that they need to consider. But what is important is that as you continue to journey with us, you continue to hold this kind of vision or idea of what we are trying to do. The first 4 weeks, we provided an overview of the National Strategic Plan and a background to how we got here. The next 6 weeks, starting today, week 5 till week 10, we are going to have what we call twin weeks. Week 5 and 6, we are going to look at the law, so the legislative framework and the lawmaking process. Because at the end of this webinar, we are being called upon to participate in the implementation of the plan, but also to make submissions to the Department of Justice and the Department of Women, Youth and People with Disabilities on some key sections of the National Strategic Plan. So week 5 and 6 is supposed to help us understand the context and the content better, but more importantly, to prepare us to participate in lawmaking processes. Week 7 and 8 is going to help us get clearer about what these councils are about. In this country, we have had a number of councils, and I think it is important to do some kind of analysis or assessment of what makes councils work when they do and what makes them not work when they do not work. So that's week 7 and 8. Week 9 and 10, it's also going to help us get more in-depth knowledge or information on the funding mechanisms. In week 3, when we're talking about the institutional arrangements, I mentioned that there is mention of funding in the plan, but there is really no clarity about how that is going to happen. So we have an opportunity to make recommendations or suggestions about the kind of funding mechanism that we would like to see. And to be able to do this, we need to learn more about the different kinds of funding mechanisms that are out there. And more importantly, the core components of what is known as feminist funds, what they fund, who they fund, and how they work. These 6 weeks, the twin weeks that focus on the legislative framework, the council, and the fund, are then going to take us to week 11 and 12, which I consider the most important weeks in this webinar series. Week 11 and 12 are the weeks where we are going to do consultations, because now we want to be able to see what people believe are the best ways for us to go forward in the implementation of this national strategic plan. And in our consultation, we are going to be focusing on this council, the legislative framework, as well as the funding mechanisms. We are going to start looking at the pillars, but not as much as we are going to look at these 3 things, because these are the things that we see as foundational to operationalizing or implementing the national strategy. So now we are going to start. You are joining the call using the phone. It's not possible to kind of mute yourself, but there is background noise. So the people on the phone, because the people who are joining are using the computer or using the other phones, they are on mute. But people who are using the phone, you know, that's not connected to the link. Yeah. Okay. So that's where I would like to kind of stop with the background and just explaining how the process is intended to unfold over the next 8 weeks. So thank you so much for joining with us and being part of the first 4 webinars, and we hope that you will be able to join us to the end of this series. So at this stage, I will just start with the presentation. Thank you. As explained, I am going to do a bit of a recap from what we discussed in week 3. And the purpose of this is to enable us to contextualize the guidance that comes from other countries, and to have an appreciation of what it is in the National Strategic Plan or the draft terms of reference that came to operationalize the council. So when we have done that recap, then we will now go into the guidance, because the guidance section is what is going to help us now make the recommendations based on things that we have seen in other countries and also guidance coming from the UN. We are going to share these resources, as we often do, where there is a lot more detail or information on this. We have a problem from people who are calling using the phone because of the background noise. the people who are dialing into the webinar. All right. At the end of the session, what we hope you will be able to understand is the relevant provisions as they are in the National Strategic Plan, these key components of similar laws, and recommendations on how some of these things can be managed effectively based on examples from other countries. Hi, can the callers joining us using the phone please be mindful of the noise, because we cannot mute them because they are using their phones. There are people who are talking in the background. Okay. The institutional arrangements, we talked about. We still have interference from the phone callers. Can people just make sure that there is no interruption? Otherwise, we will have to kind of disable the phone calls because it's really, really interfering with the sound of the webinar. Okay, sorry about this. We're just trying to sort this problem out. All right. So, right. The institutional and operational arrangements, the background was that we understand that the National Strategic Plan established these parameters to create this council, and that there are all of these key players in the implementation, and we went through who these key players are going to be, and also we're able to highlight the difference between what the National Strategic Plan said is going to happen, and also what the terms of reference said was going to happen. We then went on to talk about some of the things that were concerning, or areas where there was a disconnect between the National Strategic Plan and also the terms of reference. And this is important because these are some of the things that we want to be able to return to, so that we can highlight how the legislative framework can begin to address some of these things. The technical team, the national and local level structure, those were some of the things that we discussed in week 3, that there is an attempt in the National Strategic Plan to decentralize the council, so that it's not just what exists nationally, but there are ways in which this can be replicated at provincial and municipal level. The National Strategic Plan needs to be able to, okay, it looks like there are no slides. I need a sign. Can people see the slides now? I just need a sign. Are people able to see the slide? I'm just getting feedback that people are not able to see the slides. Okay, I'm going to continue. All right. The coordination between new and existing laws and policies and the framework. So when we're talking about when we talk about the scope of these laws, we are talking about what should be covered under this legislative framework that we are talking about. And so the National Strategic Plan makes or gives a very narrow mandate to the Department of Justice, because it says the law that must be passed is the law that really looks at the National Council on Gender-Based Violence. And we think this is a big mistake. If we want to get away from this fragmentation, we can't just legislate on the council and not look at the other things. And as we go, we are going to be able to see why it is important that the other things that are not necessarily about the council need to be legislated for or need to be clarified in the legislation so that the accountability lines are clearer. The other systems level requirement that comes from the NSP is that there must be standard frameworks that are based on equity and inclusivity within services such as mental health and shelter. When we talk about frameworks on equity and inclusivity, these are some of the kind of things that can be aspirations, you know, of plans that are there. But we do know that when it comes to implementation, it cannot just be something that we aspire to be inclusive or that we have frameworks that are based on equity. So for instance, we find that in some shelters, women or people who are not South Africans are not allowed, you know, in, or sometimes trans women are not taken in shelters for women. So this is important because if we are going to try and address problems related to inequality, problems like to kind of lack of access, these are some of the things that we cannot just leave in the plan, because if they do not happen, someone has to be held accountable, right? And the duty bearer, the person who has got the obligation to ensure that the equity and the inclusion within services has to be held accountable. So systems level requirements are some of the things that need to be inside the legislation so that the levels of accountability are clarified. We have talked about service delivery models that are adapted to the context of the delivery, right? And once again, it's a similar thing with all of these systems level requirements. Who does this? When must it be done? And what does this process of adapting to context when it comes to delivery of services begin to look like? So for instance, when we're talking about maybe command centers or call centers, you may find that in various parts of the country, you have a number of organizations or systems that are developed in the bigger metropolitans and not so much, you know, in smaller towns and all of that. So if we are telling people, call a command center because you are going to get assistance, but there is no capacity in some towns to respond to the people who are calling asking for assistance, then this is the problem, the service delivery model that's not adapted to the context of the delivery. So these cannot be things that we continue to complain about, or where we just have requirements in the NSP without being very clear about how this work happens. The integrated systems of management and information, these are the examples of what's envisaged here, is that the issue of information, information is not something that's kind of back end. People are just talking about their files. But when you have one person that different courts have issued a protection order against, then we need to be able to have an integrated system or management that is able to kind of pick up, this information, because what is it that we are talking about? The same person here, you can get a protection order, but here the court dismisses it, because maybe of how the application has been written. What is important is that because people who are working in the system have said so many times that we need to have an integrated system of management, it cannot just be left there. So the scope that has been provided for, or what Department of Justice needs to legislate on, needs to be expanded so that these things are not just left there as a series of complaints, but we now have something that enables us to get redress when those things that are supposed to happen when they don't happen. One of the biggest lies that is often told about South Africa is that South Africa has got very good laws, but the laws lack implementation. And the reason why this is a lie is that if a law is good, then the law has to have built into it not just the entitlements that a person has, but also the institutional framework that is supposed to help us when we want to realize the rights that are given in the law, right? So all of these things cannot just be aspirations. These are the things that the legislative framework, the Department of Justice, is going to develop. These are the things that we must be able to see in the law, because the lines of accountability are clearer and that there is also no fragmentation in the system. The last time we talked about these terms of reference. It is important that you spend time looking at these terms of reference because, like I said the last time, these terms of reference, they begin to give us signals or indication of how government would like to proceed. So the terms of reference is what was put in place instead of the legislative framework. So when the Inter-Ministerial Committee says we have now adopted a plan to fast track the establishment of the council, they were going to rely on these terms of reference, right? So we need to be able to engage with these terms of reference because this is the meaning that the National Strategic Plan has been given, so that we are able to provide comments and say to government that these are the limitations, or this is why these terms of reference would not work, even as a substitute for the legislative framework. But more importantly, that when you develop a legislative framework, some of the things that you have put in the terms of reference cannot be there. I mean, there are quite a number of good things in these terms of reference. And so those are the things that must be retained. But I want us to spend more time looking at the the things where we thought it was important to seek international guidance. You know, what was or what is important right now that we pay attention to. So, one of the key elements of effective implementation of the National Strategic Plan is its leadership. This is something that the National Strategic Plan tells us. This is what the 24 demands said, that this response must be coordinated in the presidency. And this is to signal that this is a problem and that government actually understands. So the best option from what we are learning is to lead the plan is an office bearer, preferably a minister or secretary of a relevant department. Preferably, this leadership would be supported by a robust gender equality machinery in government, unless this machinery does not hold significant power, then other departments may take leadership, right? So we do have a lot of structures in the country that constitute this national gender machinery. And so part of the questions are whether these machineries are fit for purpose, you know, are they robust enough to be able to hold what the plan says needs to happen? Because if they don't have this power, then we have to think about government departments that should lead this work. Right now, legislation obviously has been given to justice, and the work is happening currently housed at the Department of Women, Youth, and People with Disability. But the main national structure governing the NSP implementation must also have senior officers with decision-making powers from all key departments that are involved in the implementation. So the example, the first one comes from the Georgia Permanent Interagency Coordination Council for Implementation of Measures Against Trafficking in Persons, which is a body that was tasked with overseeing the action plan to combat trafficking. This organization was chaired by the Minister of Justice with deputy ministers from 6 other key departments. And according to UN Women Guidelines, this council has been considered successful because of its strong leadership, among other factors. Now, I want you to remember that when we were talking about the TORs, we were saying that the Inter-Ministerial Committee is what the National Strategic Plan talked about. But the terms of reference do not do that. So this is a victory that we should not lose, because we really do need people to sit in these bodies when they have, you know, power, decision-making powers. The second example is an example from Ecuador, where the National Plan for the Eradication of Gender-Based Violence Against Children was established by presidential decree, which outlined an inter-institutional commission to oversee it. And the example is especially interesting because it outlines the areas from which the members must come from, such as public health, police, education, and that they must be ministers or secretaries of state. If you remember, the listed ministries that make up the Inter-Ministerial Committee do not cover all the ministries that are affected or that are key to the implementation of the National Strategic Plan. When we're talking about behavioral attitudes and all of those things, we want to be able to see education, because that's a huge part of doing away with gender stereotypes the socialization, the sexualization, of children, women. And so these are some of the things that we need to be able to talk about. How does the legislative framework help us to outline the areas from which the members, these ministers, are going to come from? The lessons from the UN Women Guidelines and the examples show that effective governance and implementation requires powerful membership. And this is because addressing gender-based violence is complex and requires support from multiple departments and political actors as well as resources. There were other things that I mentioned. Number 5, like these criteria that we talked about, like what kind of a person, needs to be there. So these are not necessarily mutually exclusive, but it does mean that if we cannot have a minister who understands, respects, and has got knowledge of this work, then who is the next person who will be able to do this work? To comply with international guidance and make the council that we want to establish more effective, this is what the legislation must include, that the representatives must be at a certain decision-making level. And it would be helpful for the legislation to outline the departments where the key role players in the implementation of the NSP must come from, and to be very deliberate, kind of linking them to the key tasks that are in the pillars of the National Strategic Plan. So I would like us to stop there now, have our break, and really, really apologize for the technical problems that we have. I think it's a very short break. Kay?
Yes, great. Thank you so much for that, Sibongile. For everybody who's listening into the webcam, we're taking a short intermission. This is the point at which we're going to administer the poll. We'd like to know if you can hear Sibongile clearly, if she needs to slow down a little bit, or whatever we can do to make this webinar more accessible. I would like to really, really apologize for the technical difficulties that we've been experiencing today. And I would like to request that anybody, or rather everybody who's joining on the phone, to remember that when you join, we are unable to mute you, so we can hear all of the background noise that's happening where you are. So I would like to request that you keep this in mind when you join the webinar. So please try and make sure that you're in a room that's as quiet as possible, because there's no way for us to with noise. Just as I said that, there is somebody who has something going on in the background. Could I please ask that you move away and go to a place that's quieter if possible? As soon as we're able to, we're going to look into how to mute the phone calls, but for now, can you kindly just try and manage the background noise as much as you can? Okay, I am going to now just allow the poll to take place for just about 5 minutes, and we'll be back. Of course, if you have any questions, please do keep them coming on GoToWebinar, as well as Facebook, or on the WhatsApp line. Wherever you're listening to us from right now, you're welcome to ask questions during this.
Okay, salawuthengile. Uthubele. Nokokoroba phansi siphelile, akakuthenge ngendlela. Awusho ngizokoroba namanzi. Kodwa
Just for a point of clarity, please do take the poll regardless. You'll see that we still have Lindiwe's name on the poll. Apologies for that. As Spongile mentioned earlier, we had to make some last-minute changes. So this is the correct poll. Just when you are responding, please remember that we're asking about this current presentation where Spongile is the presenter.
Okay, welcome back. Okay. Can we start?
Yes.
Fantastic. All right, can you see the presentation? Good. Can you see the presentation?
No, not yet.
Fantastic. How about now?
It's not appearing. It was appearing when you came on a few minutes ago.
Good.
Yes, we see it now.
Fantastic. Welcome back, everyone. Before we had the break, we were talking about the need for leadership, and that it must be high-level leadership. Now we are going to the second point, which is about guidance. Now, both the terms of reference and the National Strategic Plan have got a number of issues where there is no guidance. How are these things going to happen? And this is where the law is normally very good, because the law is supposed to help us get clarity. Within decentralized systems, it's important that the structure at least links to cross-jurisdictional structures like it to aid in implementation and monitoring. So remember, there is an attempt to decentralize. We have the municipal, we have the provincial, and we have the national. But in both the National Strategic Plan and in the terms of reference, there is no mechanism to connect what's happening at the municipal level to provincial and national and kind of vice versa. An example of this is the Guyana's National Policy on Domestic Violence, which provides a good example of how this needs to happen. They implemented regional and local domestic violence committees that are responsible for monitoring strategies, activities, and support services, and reporting on the status of domestic violence within its region to the National Domestic Violence Oversight Committee. So this is something that can clearly be legislated for. And that the committees include police, NGOs, health clinics, community organizations, faith-based organizations, government, and probation officers. If you remember, in the National Strategic Plan and also in the TORs, these bodies, they start off at national, but then they get smaller and smaller and when you get to province, and even much smaller when you get to municipal. At the municipal level, it's basically where people live, where things are happening, where services are provided. So there is a need to make sure that where the service delivery, that those people who are playing that role are actually part of these structures, right? So this is what the legislative framework will have to be able to do, to be able to provide guidance around how these bodies are decentralized, how they are constituted. The two key lessons in the Guyana example is the role of the regional and local committees in relation to the national committee. And that the second is that the membership in the committees that is diverse and include many stakeholders and areas. Here, what we are seeing is that there are these cross-jurisdictional structures in Chapter 5, but does not outline how these working groups will communicate. They only identify local level structures as providing support and monitoring, but there are no specific requirements to report to the council or to even communicate in any way. There's also a guidance issue concerning the strong role of civil society in the implementation of the National Strategic Plan with civil society. Representatives comprising 51% of the membership of the board of directors. So it gives a lot of power to civil society members who are very knowledgeable about gender-based violence and femicide issues to make decisions to address it. Civil society often plays a minor role in other national organizations and even more heavily tasked locally. So what the legislation needs to be able to do is to describe how it intends to support these civil society organizations in implementing this, for example, through funding. The National Strategic Plan says that the government is required to provide funds to those who provide emergency services, for example. It does not outline exactly how this will happen and what's considered an emergency service. The selection of representatives of civil society that sit on government board should be public, open, and transparent. That's what the National Strategic Plan said. This selection process must outline who will nominate the members, to which members of civil society this process is open, and how the process will happen. It is important to have a clear selection process outlined especially for civil society representatives, to maintain the independence and transparency of the council. So I'm going to give two examples because these examples helps us to answer the question about what kind of civil society representatives do we need? Croatia's Council for Civil Development is an advisory body that aims to improve relationships between government and civil society. It has 12 civil society representatives, each coming from one subsector previously outlined by the Council's enabling document. These members are selected through a two-step process. First, there is the nomination, and second, there is the voting for members. In the nomination step, the government office posts a call for nomination of candidates, the criteria for selection, and deadlines. Any registered CSO or network of CSOs can nominate only one candidate and deputy for the subsector in which they operate. This is open for 15 days and all nominations are sent to the government's office in charge of it. An independent commission selected by the current council members reviews the nominations and ensures eligibility within 8 days of the deadline of submissions and posts a list of all eligible candidates on its website. All registered associations or networks have one vote each and can only vote for candidates in the field in which they are active. A list of all members and their amount of votes is posted on the office's website within 8 days of the voting deadline. The second example is from Serbia. Serbia's monitoring and evaluation of poverty reduction strategies selects its candidates through an application scoring card and interview process. Individuals are scored based on their experience with monitoring and evaluation. So here there's a maximum of 30 points. And then there's the poverty reduction program. And here you have a maximum of 20 points. Research, 30 points. Working with vulnerable groups, 20 points. Working in NGO sector, 20 points. Previous employer recommendation, 20 points. These examples outline very different processes for the selection of civil society board members. The first is more characteristic of a council where civil society function as representatives, whereas the second is better when civil society members are there as experts. As both examples show, it is crucial to have a very clear process outlined, but also to say, where do you want civil society to come from? And this is normally answered by, what do you want civil society to do, in the council? And that's why whatever criteria is set needs to be able to respond to what the people who are going to go and do that. I'm not going to talk about the NYDA candidates today. And then we know that both the NSP and the terms of reference have outlined, neither of them have outlined a clear civil society selection process. The NSP states that, of course, the 7 are going to come and they will be selected by public nomination, and that the Ministry of Women, Youth and People with Disabilities is going to do that. They will oversee this process with a technical team of not more than 5 individuals. And the terms of reference does not have an outlined nomination process, only stating that the representatives will be nominated by civil society without outlining this process. One positive aspect of the terms of reference is that it outlines the criteria for the selection of members, that they must understand the strategic. So it doesn't say how, but it begins to tell us what we need. Understand the strategic implications, outcomes, and outputs of initiatives being pursued. Appreciate the significance of the establishment of a multi-stakeholder process for the country and its fundamental principles, and the importance of representing the specific interest of all major stakeholders. Be genuinely interested and have a track record of fighting and contributing to the eradication, and have credibility and a broad understanding, knowledge, skills, and understanding of gender-based violence. Now we are going to the next issue that the legislation needs to be able to look at. In Bosnia, State Violence Against Women and Girls strategy, they outlined the lessons they learned from the implementation of the previous strategic plans. And if you remember, when Mandisa in week 2 was talking about the journey that got us here, it was about, this was not the first strategic plan. We've had a number of strategic plans passed and failed with varying degrees of success and failure. And so it was important in that plan to actually not just learn, but also to be able to say we are now addressing why we need to do this. They described the lack of funds and resources as having been the biggest challenge, right? So you can see how chapter 5, the way in which funding is kind of put there, it's not really saying how funding has been a challenge. We know that funding has been a challenge. The implementation of the strategy relies heavily on donor funds and on the relationship between its leadership and other government offices to obtain the budget. Although its strong leaders were able to get funds for the budget, it has not been enough, and the strategy has also relied on funding from donors. So this shows that although a strong leadership is important to obtain funds, it's crucial to find other ways to address funding to make it less likely problem to arise. The UN Women Implementation Guidelines advises that these plans must include short-term, mid-term, long-term activities, concrete goals, and objectives, which entity will implement each activity, a time frame for the activities, the budget allocated for each activity, and the source of funding. We do have a very detailed monitoring and implementation framework in the National Strategic Plan, but some of the things that are in the guidelines, like the source of funding, the budget allocated, are not some of the things that are there. So the last two criteria should be included within the implementation plan, because this will give legitimacy to funding requests and aid the board in obtaining the required funding for the implementation of the GBVF. You know, this is what we are told when we have strategies, like you need to cost this strategy. So we do need to cost this plan. And one example of this is the Tanzania's National Plan of Action for the Prevention and Eradication of Violence Against Women and Children. Its implementation plan has 8 categories. They have the expected outputs, the strategies, the activities, the indicators, the means of verification, the actors, the time frame, and budget. So the NSP gives duty, to the council to create a more specific plan with short-term, medium-term, and long-term priorities. Although the legislation may not have the power to mandate the budgets for this plan, it should mandate that this plan include the categories that exist in the pillars along with those that are missing, such as budget allocation and source, indicator and means of verification, like the Tanzanian example. So now I'm going to go through the recommendations. The scope of the legislation must be broader than the council, just not only focus on the council in order to ensure cohesion and avoid fragmentation in the implementation process. Clarity on the roles of the Inter-Ministerial Committee and the government representatives serving in the council. You know, you have the Inter-Ministerial Committee that's there on its own, and then you have the other government representatives in the council. What's the relationship? You know, of course, they've got different ways of doing this work. Must include a requirement that members of the board of directors that are government representatives each be representing a key department in the plan, implementation of the plan. Department of Justice and Constitutional Advancement can either outline all the departments that will have representatives or can only require that representatives come from different departments. Must include a requirement that members of the board of directors that are government representatives each have decision-making power, so preferably ministers. Here, of course, we still kind of maintain so that it doesn't get lost, that people who are implicated in domestic violence, violence against women, and GBVF issues are not eligible. The law must also outline the power, function, and obligation of cross-jurisdictional structures, including provincial and local working groups. The law must include a requirement that working groups report to the council on issues within their region, describe in clear terms how the government will support civil society organizations in implementing the plan. Don't worry so much about this. There are no details here, but week 9 and 10, this is what we are going to revisit. Outline a process for the selection of civil society members to the board of directors that clearly states every step of the process, decision makers, criteria, and timelines. And if this works for us, we can give it to NYDA. The mandate that the council, the board of directors include in its implementation plans and priorities, the categories included within the NSP pillars, and add the following categories: the budget allocation, the budget sources, the indicators, and means of verification. If you remember in week 3, we were talking about the technical teams that are listed in the TORs. That whilst the Department of Women has now set up the various working groups that focus on pillars, this is not in the TORs. We do need to be able to see these categories within the pillars, you know, that they are included in the legislative framework, so that you don't have technical teams, because of course, the things that the technical teams are looking at are important, but the pillars is what grounds, you know, the strategy. So that's the end of this presentation. Thank you very much. And once again, 1,000 apologies for the technical glitches that we had in the beginning. Thank you very much. And we can now take questions. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Sibongile, for that presentation. I would just like to encourage anybody who still has questions to send them through, and I will then ask Sibongile to answer some of them for us today. If there's anything that we don't get to, we will get to them later on. We do acknowledge that we started quite late and we may have to wrap up fairly quickly, but we are going to consider all of the questions. So just in terms of that last slide, Sibongile, that you went through, the recommendations. So we understand that these recommendations were compiled in light of the examples that you gave, because the point of this presentation was for us to learn from what other jurisdictions have gotten right. So the question for us today that perhaps some of the listeners may be wondering is, how do we put forward these recommendations? So are there any steps that we can take to put forward these recommendations based on clearly the way that it can make this NSP legislation more effective? So basically, what is the role of individuals and organizations that are interested in the NSP?
If you remember, in June, these were shared with us, the draft terms of reference, and we had that meeting with the Department of Women and lots of other civil society organizations one Saturday morning. I don't know if there has been clarity or discussion around how they are going to do that, because I think at that time when that meeting started, there was this idea that they were going to establish the council. And so part of the pushback was that we needed this legislative framework. So what's important is whether it's the people who draft laws, Department of Justice, who has been mandated with this, to be able to say, now we are starting the process, of lawmaking. So that's the official government process that would have to happen. And next week, Welegas is going to take us this process of how government actually makes laws. But as civil society, and what we would like to be able to do with this process is to begin to put together by ourselves, these recommendations. So we are learning together, we are getting insights, we are spending more time looking at how this can actually happen, and then we begin to compile. So when it comes to week 11 and 12, that's going to be the most important week, because we are saying together, let's begin to compile these recommendations, and then later on when the process officially opens, then we can now develop them into submissions. But right now we want to be able to get a sense of what people want. But this is the beginning of understanding the legislative framework. We are going to spend more time understanding the council. So hopefully people there will also have better clarity on what the councils should look like, and also the big funding questions that often makes people unhappy, to begin to say it can work, but this is how it needs to be able to work. So the official process has not yet started, but here we are beginning to organize ourselves to participate in that process when it starts.
So I think this may be a question that will be answered in the coming weeks. But I recall in your presentation from a few weeks ago, one of the things that you said is it's important for us to know what we are entitled to so that we can hold the various role players accountable should something go wrong. In this regard, is there something that we need to be mindful of as we put recommendations forward in terms of that idea of accountability and making sure that the system works, and that ultimately civil society's involvement in this process isn't something that is just swept under the rug, but it is actually taken seriously?
Okay, one of the things I think that's important is just for us to be able to understand the distinction between law and policy, although we have spent quite a bit of time, I think, in South Africa trying to make government accountable based on policies that they have made, and just trying to be able to see which, like to be able to get policies, to be enforceable and kind of legally kind of binding. Policies, can be changed, but there is something about legislation, like legislation has to go to parliament, and that's why it's important to understand what the constitution says about lawmaking in South Africa. So when we have something in law, and I think this is the most important part, it's that it's different from when it is something that government aspire towards. A few weeks ago, I made an example of how the Sexual Offences Act kind of came to look like it looked when one day we sort of got up, people having worked for years, to kind of develop a sexual offences legislation that really says this is what an effective response look like. So to wake up this one morning and see all of those other things removed because the then president felt that they had not been costed, that they were going to impose significant kind of financial burden, on the state. So when we make these things look like optional extras, not as part of what makes the substantive entitlements possible, right? So now we have a national strategic plan that says, these are the pillars. This is what we need in order to respond to gender-based violence and femicide. If in 2006 we had legislated for protection services, for psychosocial support, like all of these things that we are now talking about, because most of these things are not new. I think if there's anything new, is this idea of economic justice, like making that direct link between women's lower economic status and their exposure to violence. So, but all of these things are things that have always been there as we were legislating. So it now becomes important to say, in order to hold someone accountable, because we know what works, we know what should be there, we have to create this obligation, in law, that this is not something that we can do without, this is not something that just happens, because it's not a nice to have, it's a core component of the response. It's a positive obligation, of the state to ensure that this, that we are able to eradicate. Now that we have been able to agree to these pillars, the work that has to happen there cannot be left by chance. This is not chance work.
Okay, great. Thank you for that. We don't have any more questions. However, there are some comments that have come through, and I'll just read these out, and you can let us know if you've got any reflections on these based on the presentation that you gave today. So we have a comment here from Motlako. And the comment is, the issue is for the structure to be constituted. We have seen the failure of structures such as the IDMT and the previous council because they were not constituted. Okay. And the other one is, integrating all three spheres of government is possible on paper, but what happens on the ground is totally different. There's no synergy. An example are the VECs. The reception might need feasibility. Holding rooms are still not conducive for victims. Okay, so those are some of the comments that are coming through there. I don't think there's anything else. Do you have any reflections on those or any concluding remarks in this regard? And then just one more thing, sorry, before you carry on. We will share this presentation with anybody who joined us or who wasn't able to join us. So if you are able to look at the presentation after the fact and reflect, and you have more questions, please feel free to send them through. So this is really not the end of this engagement. We're just going to close up. Spongile, any final remarks from you?
So Swazi Mbogani, I think, she's the one who makes the point about this integration being possible on paper, and that what happens on the ground is totally different. It just takes us to the previous point, is that someone has to be held accountable. Who is this person? Who is this entity who has to make sure that this actually happens? You know, the thing that actually holds it together, because we can't keep on winning on paper and not winning on practice. So the need to speak to designing things that ensure accountability is what we need to be able to get better at, because that's what we need to be able to answer. Is if this thing that we know needs to happen is not happening, then who must be held accountable? You know, I often say that the constitutional question of our time has always been, it's one question that's asked in two different ways. What is it that they did that they were not supposed to do, which is the state? Or what is it that they didn't do that they were supposed to do? You know, so because we understand that they are responsible, you know, they are the ones who have an obligation. So even if we go and we assist, but we cannot keep on acting like government doesn't have power, like government, you know, is a victim of all of these things. And that's why it's important that we empower ourselves to do accountability work. Because if it means that that's the only way in which government wants to be able to respond, right? Then maybe that's how we learn to work with government. But there is no reason for all of these processes to be set up, all of these structures to be built, and we still have people say that it actually, you know, doesn't work. So we know that it does not work, and I think that's why we need to be insistent now in that we just don't want you to aspire to it. Tell us what happens when you don't do, because we've had this conversation a number of times around what it is that you need to be able to do. Mutlako raises a similar point. She says the issue is for the structure to be constituted. We have seen the failure of structures such as IDMT and the previous councils because they were not constituted. And that's exactly the point that we were talking about. So it's what's the criteria for eligibility, but also what do you say? I had feedback that I had somehow misrepresented the number of people that are even going to be on the council. And if we look at TORs, if there is a number other than the number, you know, that I said in terms of how the council is going to be constituted, let us see the proposed organogram, you know, from the TORs. Who is going to be working there? We've got the board. We understand the board is going to have those numbers of people, but how is the secretariat going to be structured? You know, because these are the people who are going to do day-to-day, you know, implementation. So it becomes important that we don't just say on paper that we have a structure that's going to do something, but that we are actually very clear about their funding. And that's why when we're talking about, as the people who are going to do resource mobilization for this plan, what are the activities that are you putting there? You know, what are you costing as the budget items? Because obviously we can't have these kind of PPE kind of scenarios that's engulfing us, you know, being the order of the day. If you don't have line items, if you have no clarity about what things cost, that's what normally happens, where you end up kind of paying for things that should not be paid for. So let's have a budget. Let's have clarity about what it is. What are these structures going to cost us? You know, what are we paying people? You know, who is getting paid? You know, who's receiving per diem, who's receiving salary? So it is quite key that we fight for that. Like, we cannot just fight for the substantive. The institutional is what we need to insist on when it comes to the strategic plan. So yeah, I will kind of stop there for now.
Okay. Thank you so much. I have just two more reflections, and I do acknowledge that with some of them you have already gone through potentially what the answers are, but if there's anything additional you'd like to add, you can go ahead. I'll start with a question that came from, sorry, just give me a second. I had this just now. That came from Tiki. What is the role of regulations in enacting legislation? In relation to your point, this is in relation to your point about policy implementation. And then the next one is from Janet, and she said, thank you for the insightful presentation. Quick question, to what extent have the recommendations or input from the November 2018 summit been taken into account? She's concerned here, oh, sorry, just give me a second. She's concerned about the iterative process.
Sorry, Kay, she's concerned about which process? I didn't get that.
Oh, sorry, my computer has just, it's just turned itself off. Okay, so the question from Janet is basically, to what extent has what came out of the summit incorporated in the things that you were speaking about today in your presentation?
Okay, so let's start with Nzigi. I think Nzigi's question is the impact of regulations on the law. Am I understanding that correctly?
Yes, so it's what is the role of regulations in enacting legislation?
So you normally have the law first, and then in order to operationalize some of the things that are contained in the law, then the relevant government departments get tasked with the development of regulations, but the enabling framework is normally the legislation. And then those regulations get adopted, and then that's why sometimes you'll find that there is a law, but it's not being operationalized because the regulations are outstanding. Yeah? And so the second question I think that Janet is asking about the relationship between the summit declaration. If you look at both the National Strategic Plan and the terms of reference, there is a lot of kind of alluding to the outcomes of the summit. 2 weeks ago, I think, when I was talking about that, about the institutional and operational framework, it was also something that I highlighted, you know, so it's not, the summit declaration is not something that we have abandoned. And I think even the National Strategic Plan is very clear about how that needs to happen. So the document that we are trying to operationalize, also that we're trying to implement in the National Strategic Plan, are those outcome, you know, reflection, those summit declarations. So to the extent, I think, and part of the vigilance that is required from civil society, we are the ones who have to ensure that nothing slips this time. So if there are things that we feel in the terms of reference in the National Strategic Plan go against what was agreed to the summit, we have to be able to say this is not what we agreed to. And if things have to change, we also need to be able to understand how and why the things need to change. Yeah, so I think we sort of come to the end. Okay.
Yes, thank you so much. We have come to the end of today's session. I would like to thank you for taking this time to take us through this session, Sibongile. As I mentioned, the materials are going to be available after the presentation. However, for anybody on GoToWebinar, there is a section that says handouts, and you are able to access the PowerPoint from there. Again, please do keep your questions coming. Even if you have questions from the first week, that's perfectly fine. Please let us know. This really is our NSP, and we want everybody to be engaged, ask any questions, even if they seem very, very basic. We're very open to trying to get everybody on the same page so that we really can make this process as effective as possible. We look forward to seeing you again next week. At the same time, as Sibongile mentioned, Welekazi will be with us next week, and she'll be going through how laws are made in South Africa. So if you have any questions already that you'd like to have her ask, again, you're free to send those through before the session. Otherwise, during the session, we'll be engaging. Thank you so much to everybody who joined us on GoToWebinar, on Facebook, on Twitter, on YouTube, on any other platform that everybody was listening to. Thank you so much. We look forward to seeing you again next week. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Ciao, ciao. Bye.